Happy Canada Day, hosers. That's right, it's that time of year once again, when Canadians from all walks of life come together to watch parades, see fireworks, get absolutely plastered, and watch Trudeau make an ass of himself in front of the whole country. Not necessarily in that order. So today, I figured we could talk about an influential Canadian figure from a long time past. And since I solely exist to spite the federal government at this point, we will be covering an Albertan, asterisk. Now, I already have a track record of covering very, very niche people, but this guy is so niche that unless you took a Canadian history course at a Canadian university in this half of the country, you probably would never have known that he even existed. This is the story of Bible Bill Aberhart. In the most cosmic twist of irony possible, this uniquely Albertan story starts in Ontario of all fucking places. William Aberhart was born in Kippen, a tiny village in what is now the municipality of Bluewater, on either the 30th or 31st of December 1878. His father was a recent German immigrant, while his mother was from Ontario, and he was the middle child of 8. Notably, his parents were not overly religious. This may be surprising considering the nickname. William's religiosity was entirely self-developed. He did attend Sunday school at a Presbyterian church from a young age, but that was kind of just what you did with kids in that day, regardless of whether you were religious or not. His family was reasonably well off for the 1880s, so he went to school and, as usual, did normal child things. In school, he was a hard worker and a decently smart cookie, and he is described as being somewhat introverted. Apparently, he kicked ass at soccer, though. In 1896, he would take 3 months of schooling in Mitchell, allowing him to become a teacher, afterwards having a brief stint in business school in Chatham, Kent, Ontario. In 1901, he would get his first teaching position in Brantford. He was, by most accounts, that teacher. You know, that one teacher you had in high school that was somehow both the biggest asshole and fairest grader? He apparently addressed the students by number and had a habit of beating the shit out of them for any perceived slight. Because, you know, this was legal back then. The staff absolutely loved the guy though, which fast-tracked him to higher positions. When the principal of the school died in 1905, Aberhart replaced him, and over literal children and underpaid teachers alike, he ruled with a fist of iron. 1902 is when he also got married, and he would have 2 daughters from the relationship. As he went through school and later post-secondary, his religious interpretations of Christianity varied wildly as he developed his own views of the Bible and the religion as a whole. During his time in Brantford, he studied at a Presbyterian church in his spare time, and he settled on the idea of dispensationalism. I won't claim to be an expert in religious philosophy, quite the contrary, so I have the comprehension of a particularly dense goldfish and therefore have no fucking idea how to explain it. It has something to do with the covenants God made with man, and assumes a literal and prophetic interpretation of the Old Testament, and that's about where my smooth brain stops. Regardless, not the topic of this video. What matters is that it's very evangelical and very Protestant. This would go on to influence his later careers quite heavily, which is why I bring it up. Anyways, in 1910, he was headhunted by the Board of Education for a certain city in a certain brand new province in Western Canada. That city was Calgary. At this point in history, it is a bit of a boom town with around 40,000 people living there when Aberhart made his move. Granted, it was still kind of a shithole in what was very much the middle of nowhere, but it was there and it was new and exciting because it was the last best west and other buzzword. He jumped between a couple until he ended up at Crescent Heights High School, where he would remain principal for 2 decades. Under his rule, the school was organized and well-performing, and he did relax his dictatorial nature somewhat. All told, he was a very skilled administrator and got along reasonably well with everyone. His teaching career was long and eventful, and he pioneered several concepts such as student councils and parent-teacher associations, but I won't go into too much more details since this was literally just him doing his job for the most part. He would also teach at churches. He had a knack for drawing crowds, first at a Presbyterian church, where he got kicked out of for the whole prophecy thing, then at a succession of Methodist churches, and finally a Baptist one in 1915, where he became a pastor. In 1918, he would start a little Bible study group at this church, which would rapidly explode in popularity. Aberhart was a very charismatic man, and it showed through his ability to command the congregation. He would also hop on the airwaves starting in 1925, broadcasting his sermons to an audience across Western Canada. This popularization led to him receiving the moniker Bible Bill. Yep. Literally, the only reason his entire religious background matters is because I needed to explain the origin of the nickname. Of course, not everyone agreed with his interpretation of Christianity, and the Baptists started to absolutely fucking hate his guts. So in 1927, he split off and went and did his own thing. 2 years later, there was another split, this time from some of his loyalists who decided to go back to the regular Baptists. Overall, a pretty average Protestant experience. His beliefs ebbed and flowed with time, and he would remain active in the community he had created for much of his life afterwards. Now it's the 1930s, and whoops, the economy's fucked. The western provinces, being largely agricultural, meant they got smashed by the Depression. And with the provincial and federal governments seemingly incapable of fixing things, people started turning to more interesting theories of economics and politics. Aberhart was no exception, and in 1932 he found himself looking at a particularly strange idea from across the pond. Now, pause. Gonna take a detour from our story of one funny guy to talk about another. This guy is C.H. Douglas, and he is from a shithole called the United Kingdom. He was an engineer by trade, and during his time as an engineer, he would try to solve economics in the most engineer way possible. During the First World War, Douglas noticed that the cost to buy things that companies made always exceeded the wages of the workers they employed. In essence, the workers could not afford to buy the shit that they themselves produced. This was a rather concerning thought, since a chronic lack of purchasing power would, in theory, cause an economic downward spiral. So Douglas came up with social credit. Simply put, you fix the lack of purchasing power by making people have more money. He theorized that average prices increased faster than average wages, which, I mean, yeah, and this would create a never-ending cycle of people taking on debt to buy things. It would also lead to companies producing things that nobody wanted and or could afford. This all added together to create an endless cycle of recessions. He had this thing called A plus B theorem with a neat little graph that apparently proved his point. His solution to this issue was essentially stimmy checks every month to inject money into the economy and make sure that purchasing power kept up with costs. He wanted to abolish recessions by decree. The line also included heavy government control over economic affairs, primarily targeting banks. Politically, Douglas proposed a rather technocratic system, opposing party politics and preferring an authoritarian parliament directly appointed, is the word, I guess, by the people. I say appointed because he wanted the abolition of secret ballots, which means by default democracy dies. Finally, he was a rather religious man, and SocialCred was very Christian in structure. Could have its own whole ass video, but that's not what we're here for. This is about Bill Aberhart and his time with Social Credit, which was a whole shit show in and of itself. At this point in time, the leading party in Alberta was the United Farmers, and they were not having a good time. The depression hit the farmers in Alberta the hardest, and when the government literally named after you can't seem to fix things, you tend to turn your back. Aberhart started whining very loudly, trying to get the UFA to adopt the SocialCred economic model, which they refused to do. It's not known if he fully understood the whole system. There's always a chance that he just saw Christian, free money, and authoritarian and went, ooh, I like that one, but he supported it nonetheless. He helped found the Social Credit Party of Alberta to spite the UFA, and entered MLA candidates in the 1935 election. The main promise was a $25 a month dividend to adults as the first step of their monetary reform policy. Now, when you literally promise to give people money when you rise to power, people tend to notice. So SocialCred won a landslide victory in that election. This freaked everyone out because nobody expected this shit to actually work, but it did. The UFA was wiped out completely and relegated to the dustbin of history, and Aberhart had accidentally made himself Premier of Alberta. A man with zero political clout, no legal experience, and a very strange economic system was now running the province. Shenanigans ensue. He would serve as Premier, Education Minister, and Attorney General all at once, and his administrative skills from his time as principal made him well suited for the job. A few years prior, he had outlined his ideas in a paper co-written with a communist that proposed very extreme measures which would have placed the concept of money itself under the jurisdiction of the provincial government. Even excluding the obvious authoritarianism, no one actually took this seriously, and the voters only gave a shit about the free money part. Funnily enough, Douglas hated Aberhart and saw him as a goon who was misinterpreting his gigabrained idea. And because Aberhart never expected to win in the first place, he had no concrete plans for actually getting things done. He did still try his best, though. That being said, no amount of skill or theory can fix the province being piss poor. As a result, his SocialCred reforms never actually got fully implemented. Can't give everyone $25 a month when you, can't fucking afford it. Furthermore, the feds doing a bit of trolling is not a new concept, and unfortunately for Aberhart, they were not at all interested in monetary reform of this magnitude. Banking and related policy was federally controlled, and they were willing to kick people who tried to fuck with that power. His attempts to rein in private banks failed rather quickly. This had the ripple effect of fucking up the economy even further, as many investors freaked out and jumped ship with their money. People still wanted their free stuff though, so he attempted to introduce things called prosperity certificates in 1936. It was a weird scrip type deal where you could exchange the certificate for real money at certain points in its lifespan. Nobody liked them, so they fell through quickly. He did make moves to alleviate the depression, borrowing some points from the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation by setting up poverty relief programs, organizing public works projects, and freezing foreclosures and debt collections. He streamlined and professionalized the school system in the province and brought in pretty standard labor and healthcare reforms that did improve quality of life. He was also still religious, so naturally he added his own SocialCon twist, bringing in extreme alcohol regulations that were basically one step away from prohibition. Finally, his government brought in legislation that allowed for MLAs to be recalled if their constituents bitched loudly enough. This led to a petition by his own constituents to have him removed. Fun times all around. Probably the most important series of events during this time was the Backbenchers Revolt in 1937. Aberhart's failure to get any SocialCred policy through pissed off a bunch of more purist MLAs who threatened to sink the government through a no-confidence vote. After 4 months of insurgency, which saw half his cabinet evaporate, he agreed to share power with a committee intent on bringing social credit to Alberta regardless of Aberhart, and they had Douglas send 2 hardliners to get shit done. These 2 goons had de facto control over the government, which pissed Aberhart off. The goons immediately forced a loyalty pledge from all MLAs, then got to work engaging in a little tomfoolery. Well, they tried. They started with 3 bills designed to make the people of Alberta hate the federal government. That's right, Danielle. Western alienation was a British psyop. They have played us for absolute fools, those degenerate fucks. These 3 bills would have put all banks under party control, not provincial, stripped the legal rights of those who refused to comply, and made it so Alberta laws could not be challenged in court without lieutenant governor approval. Obviously, the feds shut this shit down, which allowed the party to paint them as the bad guys. Later in 1937, they were reintroduced in a modified format to be slightly more palatable, along with Aberhart bringing in 2 more, one which jacked taxes on banks and one which essentially required you to get government approval to criticize the government. This time, the lieutenant governor refused to sign them, which caused the Supreme Court of Canada to get involved. It was called the Alberta Press Case, and it essentially concluded that Canada had an implied Bill of Rights which included freedom of the press, and that all the other shit was unconstitutional because banking isn't your fucking job. This meant that all SocialCred legislation would be dead on arrival, and the dream of real social credit died with that. Shit got worse though. One of Douglas's cronies also got caught printing pamphlets encouraging folks to, fucking murder several people who opposed the program. He was promptly arrested on criminal libel, found guilty, sentenced to hard labor, and then deported back to Britain. The committee largely lost power as a result, but they would remain a force within the party until its disbanding in 1948 for being anti-Semitic and wanting to abolish democracy. After this whole shit show, the extent of Aberhart's legacy would be the creation of the Alberta Treasury Branch in 1938. He couldn't bring existing banks under provincial control, so he just made a provincial bank and the feds let that slide. To this day, it remains the only provincially run bank in Canada. Thankfully, the rest of his political career was much less eventful. Implementation of any real policy was suspended following the outbreak of World War II, but despite the shenanigans, SocialCred remained fairly popular with the people. Aberhart would win re-election in 1940 with a much smaller majority, but a win is a win. Unfortunately, his term would be cut short. While visiting his daughters in Vancouver, he died unexpectedly on May 23, 1943 at the age of 64. He was succeeded as leader of SocialCred by Ernest Manning, who would divorce SocialCred from Douglas's theory completely and instead lead it down a more traditional conservative path. The party remained dominant, winning huge majorities in every election until 1971, where they would be dethroned by the resurgent progressive conservatives of Peter Lougheed. The party largely ceased to exist in the following decades. Social credit would become a Canada-wide phenomenon, but its success was varied and very rarely did they adapt the true Douglas philosophy. In British Columbia, a very factionalized party did exist, but it very much rejected most of Aberhart's ideas and especially his religiosity. They would have limited success until 1951, when the party was rebuilt as a populist conservative movement without any real SocialCred policy, afterwards having a long half-century of success before being completely destroyed in the 1990s. The movement also found support in Quebec, but in a very orthodox way with a healthy mix of hardline conservative Catholicism. The near-dictatorial rule of the Union Nationale ensured that their success was middling, and after several factional splits and the nationalists backing the Parti Québécois in the 70s, they largely fell apart and would disappear completely by the 1980s. Social credit parties existed in other provinces, but they had little success. Federal social credit also existed and had a long and storied history which I won't get into because this video is long enough already, but it was a middle-of-the-road party about the size of the current NDP. By the late 1980s, it hemorrhaged support and lost official party status. Other parties have existed since then that have utilized certain SocialCred principles, but they were always fringe groups. It was largely superseded by the Reform Party of Canada, run by Preston Manning, which would go on to have solid political success. As for Aberhart, he remains an interesting figure in Canadian history. He has a high school in Calgary that is named after him, and his influence would spread across Canada with the popularization of his social credit idea. In 1974, he was also named a Person of National Historic Significance by the federal government, and he has a plaque at his old stomping grounds of Crescent Heights High School. He serves as an intriguing look into some of the wacky shit that people got up to in the past 100 years. He is the epitome of anyone can cook. How well they cook is up to personal taste. That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.